Hello everyone, Rob Rousseau here, just reminding you to please smash the subscribe button as well as the bell and the thumbs up, leave a comment, and hey, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe over on Patreon, patreon.com/Rob Rousseau. Okay, that's all. I'll talk to you later. Bye. Just to introduce everyone, we've got Jorge Rocha. Is an organizer based out of Brooklyn. He's the co-chair of the North Brooklyn branch of NYC DSA and is the co-host of the Leftist Theory and History podcast, Everybody Loves Communism. Also on the Asia and Oceania subcommittee for the DSA's International Committee. Welcome, Jorge.
Well, thank you for having me on.
I've also got Grayson Lanza, an Orlando-based organizer born and raised in Florida. He's the co-chair of Orlando DSA and a member of the Americas and Asia and Oceania subcommittees for the DSA International Committee. Welcome, Grayson, as well.
Thanks for having me on.
I guess, first of all, the basic question to start things off, what did you think about David Cleon's piece in The Nation? What does the left need to do about China? Do you have an answer for that question? I was just kind of talking about this before you came on, but what do you think the left should be doing anything about China? What do you think we should be doing? What did you think about this piece?
I think going to the piece first and foremost, honestly, I think it's important to kind of point out that it doesn't even really litigate what should be done. For the most part, it's just talking about certain people, certain figures that identify with the left, their grievances that they have with other people. And it doesn't really talk about what should be done, right? It's not it doesn't even really meet its own goal. So even if it did, it doesn't even really talk about that. I mean, the question of what the left should do, right? As the U.S. left is obviously a much more in-depth discussion to have. But generally the view, right? And I'm just speaking in my personal capacity here, but the views of many and that were not represented in the piece is that we have a duty to oppose imperialism by the United States first and foremost, right? The United States is the world's foremost imperial power. It has the largest, most well-funded and technologically advanced military on earth. It uses it. And we should be doing everything in our power to stop that from being used and stop that from oppressing people across the globe. And so in relation to China, that's first and foremost where we start, right? How are we ratcheting down tensions? How are we stopping U.S. intervention and meddling in China's sovereignty, right? That's what we should be discussing, not how we manage to also criticize China at the same time. And a lot of people have pointed this out, but it's we can't even get the U.S. government to do what we want. So why? It's just kind of an absurd premise. It's a bad premise from the beginning, right? And it only naturally ended in the conclude. It makes sense that the viewpoints that were represented in that showed up because the very framing of it is inherently already implicitly advocating for some sort of intervention. I mean, they talk about sanctions.
Yeah, and I think, to kind of add on to what Grayson was saying, it's important to be, very careful here. I don't think it's appropriate to suggest that, especially people who got interviewed who are members of DSA, and, David Cleon says in the article, everyone that's there does have a kind of consensus and everyone that got interviewed has a consensus that, any kind of escalation with China is not something that anyone is suggesting. However, there is kind of, and nor, at least in my position, I don't think Grayson is easier suggesting that anyone that's being interviewed who's a DSA member is suggesting anything like that. So to kind of make sure we kind of make that clear, because I think it's just be speaking about something that's ongoing, especially in DSA. Just that's a active this debate and discussion is quite sensitive. So we must be keen on that. That being said, I think what is kind of Grayson saying about these kind of somewhat a proxy fight of sorts of kind of discussing of internal deliberations that some of these individuals have tried to push before in DSA, particularly in the International Committee, that there is a sense of a wanting to kind of speak to the media to suggest to kind of push what they're arguing for, which in a certain sense is I understand where they're coming from, but I think a failing of the article, at least from my point of view, is that there is a certain overemphasis on a certain perspective that is like in certain actors in this piece. So a lot of these positions held by people who are in DSA, especially in the International Committee and Asia Oceania Subcommittee, are a minority position. And David Cleon, to his credit, he does kind of mention that, but I think it's not emphasized sufficiently enough, because it does make it seem like there's this large amount of support for a kind of more, you could call it, like, say, anti-tanky or whatever position you want to call it, or like it's like, I hate
that word.
I mean, I
yes.
think it's a pretty silly word, especially if you want to use it towards speaking towards a national publication. But whatever terminology you want to use for it, the fact of the matter is that to kind of have this position, a lot of these individuals kind of have a minority position in this international subcommittee for Asia and Oceania, and particularly the China Working Group, which is where Alan Wang, who is the co-chair of the Asia Oceanic Subcommittee, who was interviewed in the Nation article, is pointing to, is suggesting that there was a deliberation about, say, for example, a statement on Hong Kong, and there was a 3-1 vote suggesting that we don't want to make a statement on it. This is not to suggest that the official position of the subcommittee, and therefore in the International Committee, is that there is this huge defense in terms of any actions that, say, China did in terms of Hong Kong. Rather, it's that we're choosing not to make a statement on it, which is very different than what say certain people in the article who were interviewed wanted to suggest. That's what they wanted.
Yeah. I guess the thing that I find that's troubling about it as well is that I think anyone that's been paying attention can probably notice the fact that there has been this very sort of intense Western propaganda campaign that's been ongoing now for the last 2 years, and you see how people's opinion that's radically shifted people's opinions, and it forces people that they feel the need that we do need to take some kind of stance, right? I guess that's the odd thing, and then you see. you mentioned the idea that there's an actual serious piece in the Nation being published about this kind of stuff that unironically uses the word tankies, and the way that this has really become sort of a split and a really divisive issue on the left. I think it's really indicative of that. And when you see that, you can really understand why this propaganda campaign is ongoing for that exact reason, because it kind of runs counter to having solidarity with one another, and it causes these kind of splits and these kinds of arguments. So what's been your reaction working within DSA, with people that are more skeptical about this kind of new Cold War situation, and how have you been trying to convince people to see your viewpoint of it, in a non-alienating way? Have you had success with that in terms of talking about this openly and honestly with one another?
I'll go for it, Grayson.
No, you go ahead.
All right. I guess a question I want to ask before, at least for myself answering, is in what context do you mean? In the context within other members in DSA, or do you mean just speaking to people who are outside of the organization?
I think just in general, I would be interested to hear both, because I know it's something that if you're plugged into these kind of leftist arguments, it can be it can cause real conflict with people, especially when you get these issues of human rights that get mixed into it. And that's exactly why I think these campaigns about human rights take on these kind of forms, because it becomes really difficult and alienating, I think, when you're trying to take sort of a nuanced stance or showing critical support to another country, and then people start to view you as being somehow violent or somehow authoritarian or these things. So I'm just wondering what the experience has been both within DSA and overall with just sort of being able to talk to people about this viewpoint, and whether you've had success with that, or whether you have found that result to be alienating and frustrating.
So within DSA, there's, at least from what I can tell, there's almost without a doubt a consensus in terms of being opposed to this kind of idea of any kind of increasing an escalation against China by the United States. I think that people have been very receptive to that, and in terms of kind of any kind of degree in terms of what kind of position people might have, people are willing to kind of hear a discussion or even contemplate or entertain certain kind of position that they don't necessarily hold in the moment in time, whether it's kind of a political conviction or whether they kind of have their own kind of qualms regarding any representation of what's occurring in China or what China's actions. But I think in general, from the experience that I've had in terms of speaking to people within DSA and other organizers that are not as focused on international committee issues or international issues, I think generally there does seem to be kind of a very receptive, if not just outright consensus to being opposed to kind of a Cold War, this Cold War that the United States is kind of pushing forward. In terms of specific action, that's where it kind of breaks down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for people within DSA, Jorge is exactly right in that like it's not as controversial as it is portrayed publicly is I think the way to describe it. And I think that's actually something we should talk about personally. I think I'd like to talk about that. Rob, it's your show, so whatever you want to talk about.
I'm happy to hear. I'm happy to hear whatever your thoughts are on this. You're carrying me through this. I'm very ill prepared, honestly.
Well, I think within DSA, right? Like I'm from Florida. If you're already identifying as like a socialist in Florida, typically you come in with an anti-imperialist bent because you're just slammed here, right? Like if you're willing to be like, oh, I'm on the left, I'm a socialist, right? Like you're willing to take that step here. You probably support BDS. You probably are opposed to imperialism, right? Like in general, and like you just don't really have a choice. Like you can't really like ride that line. The Biden people will come down here and they'll wear shirts like no fascism, no communism, vote Democrat, right? Like it's like, all right, great. Like you don't have much of a choice. So it's not hard to convince people. It's not even really like that difficult. I think it's a pretty easily received thing. And then when just talking to like people even off the street, I think the average person, if you engage them on like even the China issue, they're very receptive, right? Because it's like, especially with COVID, it's like, all right, guys, even if every awful thing they say about China is true, which obviously it's not, but like even if that is true, what is that like? Okay, well, you live in the United States, right? Like it's more apparent than ever that it's a meaningless thing. It's not like people are like, well, at least I live in the land of the free, right? Like it really doesn't carry any sort of weight with people. I talk to people all the time, right? Like people will ask me, they know I'm a nerd. They'll be like, oh, what do you think about this? And I'll say, and they're like, yeah, that makes sense to me. But I think where you see this breakdown, right, where you see this kind of sort of controversy, right? Like, and I think this, and it's very purposeful. I do think it's like a conscious thing. I think people are aware of it. Is like those who control like kind of your traditional or more mainstream or more like elite catering mediums, like for conveying these ideas or discussing these ideas. And so even within DSA, the people who have access to these platforms, even though they themselves, right, are easily like clear and by and away minority positions, if not fringe positions within DSA, like their opinions, they get quoted, they get their articles published.
And we saw this in this piece as well. Yeah,
like these people, and then they go, oh yeah, I'm in DSA. Obviously they're not saying they speak for the organization, but the way that it gets portrayed and how they kind of imply and use platforms, people go to read that and they're going to go, Jesus, like DSA, really? Right? Like it's not, you would not, if you read the David Klein article, like unless you have some clue of like the insider baseball, you're not going to know that these people don't even like participate, right? Like even the people who self-identify as DSA members in that, they don't participate in the organization like at all, right? Like almost all they do is like say they're a part of it and then publicly litigate and undermine the democratically decided positions that people like we've taken, right, as an organization that are deliberated, that there's discussion, like frank, honest discussions. Like it's not like these are unilateral decisions being made. There's actual like it's a organic body of people with structures and rules and expectations. And so suddenly we have to be like conveying to people like this is not like actually what anyone thinks about. And we hosted an event, a panel event with some great speakers, including Vijay Prashad, who is also honestly smeared in this article, right, and he's having to kind of litigate it now, including Vijay Prasad, right, like on China and on, this kind of hybrid war, Cold War situation that the United States has been engaging in and attempting with China. And I think people deserve to know that kind of stuff, and should know that, right? Like it's not cool, but like there is absolutely a like farming of this kind of rhetoric and pushing of these like platforming of these ideas, and it's very much sought out and pushed in front of people on purpose.
Yeah. Okay, so before we go on, I have a question from the chat here that it seems kind of interesting. From Lit Lisa Simpson, who says, I have a question. I'm an organizer for my local chapter's international committee. Beyond socialist education, how do I connect what's happening in my city to international socialism? This committee doesn't have a natural workflow, and I want to change that. Do either of you two have an answer for that?
Well, the first thing I would suggest is join the National International Committee. And then, because if you are part of the National International Committee, we were able to be plugged in with organized remote across the country. That's how I know Grayson, for instance, even though I live in Brooklyn. And it's like you are able to kind of connect. I think it's how you're able to connect with organized from everywhere. So that's the first thing I would suggest. And you can connect with us. We can also help you in terms of how best to work with your own local conditions. So that's probably the first thing, but also, inform yourself in terms of what are the issues people are caring about. Because an example I can imagine, I don't know where you're from, but if say you lived in somewhere, like say there used to be a much more industrial area in the country, discussing about say the moving of factories, that has a very the conversation of international socialism and also the flow of capital across the world has a very direct, although over a long period of time, impact on people's lives. It's just that requires a much longer conversation. But people are aware of that, and people react well to that fact. There are people I knew, in my own family, for instance, that they had to move, they lost their jobs because their factories moved. But this was, they moved like decades ago, and they moved to Mexico. The factories did, and so that's the case of a lot of people around this country. So I think that discussion of international socialism can also have that discussion as well.
Great. So one tricky thing that comes up in these conversations on the left about China is people will, point to China's embrace of, opening up for capitalist investment and kind of this embrace of using elements of capitalism in order to like build up its productive forces. This is the kind of the controversy about Dengism and whether that's been successful or not, or whether it counts as still being a socialist country or not. That's kind of where a lot of people get tripped up as well. I'm wondering, for people that are skeptical about that and skeptical about, well, why do I need to show critical support for China? It's just a capitalist country. How do you square that circle, and how do you explain that to people in a way that makes them understand like why it's important for us to critically support China, not uncritically, and not without any preconditions or anything like that, or to fetishize or anything like that. But how do you square that circle and to get people that are uncomfortable with this idea that they've used capitalism this way, and get them to see your perspective about why we do need to show internationalist solidarity with China and their project?
I think something, and if you want to go ahead, Grayson, let me know. But something I wanted to mention, which is like really important on this point, I think kind of gets lost, is the context those kind of market reforms occurred in. Yeah, it's really important because in 1989, when like a lot of the majority of market reforms occurred, this, China is like coming from the wake of, say, the Cultural Revolution, which was a tumultuous period in China's history. And a lot, 1979, 1989, like during that period of time, a lot of people in the party, but also in the Chinese population, wanted to kind of have a, more stability given how tumultuous the past 20, 30 years was in China. And in 1989, the per capita GDP of China was around $200. That should tell you the extent as to the level of poverty that existed for hundreds of millions of people in China. You know, many people were illiterate, and many people lived mostly in the rural countryside. In 2019, the per capita GDP was $10,000 to $12,000 around that amount. That was effectively a 40 times increase in the per capita GDP of a country. Now, this is important because when you have a significant increase in standard of living, if we are interested in terms of, as socialists, of improving the living conditions of the most exploited people in the world, and also the exploited and workers around the world, we cannot ignore the fact that the real living conditions of 850 million people have been lifted from absolute abject poverty and actually being able to have, there are more people in absolute poverty, like the metrics that are measured by the WHO, that live in the United States than live in China. This is something that should be startling. Now, that's not to suggest that the economy of China right now is not capitalist, or at least in terms of the way that it manifests in terms of the market economy. But that is very distinct to suggest, like, you know, this is something intentional to be done by the Communist Party to use as a mechanism to improve the living conditions of China, as a means to then have productive forces and material conditions to then allow to such that, you know, it's kind of like that old motive of the manifesto, or like, you know, of Marx, basically, from each according to their needs, to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability. You must be able to create a society and a system, and such that it allows for people to kind of produce in a society such that everyone can be taken care of. And if you do not have these kind of productive forces in a civilization to be able to take care of everybody, then you first must acquire them. And that's what is kind of the context for that.
I think, yeah, I mean, I kind of take a more personal angle with people because I actually like, I mean, that's all exactly right. And the only thing I would add is, like, in very simple, it's kind of like a basic Marxist concept, right? Like, you have feudalism, and then you have capitalism, and then you get communism, right? So the Chinese Communist Party is directing and guiding itself out of the remnants of feudalism through capitalism. Like, that's one of those things where people kind of are like, Marx hated capitalism, right? It's like, well, no, and Marxists did, like, they viewed it as like a necessary step in the development of society. And so the Chinese Communist Party is just very purposefully and very targeted and very intelligently building these productive forces. I went to China in 2013, so about 8 years ago, and I went to a province called Guizhou, which is I think today is still the poorest province in China. It would be basically unrecognizable. Like, people ask me, oh, what do you think of China? It's like, honestly, my experiences don't really even reflect what it is today, because it's so fundamentally different, like fundamentally different. I have friends there that I still keep in touch with, like, and again, this whole thing, like, China's some like horrific authoritarian, like totalitarian hellscape. It's like, I have people, they email me and message me on Instagram. Like, it's not that big of a deal, right? Like, we just talk about like work and shit. But I lived in like a rural village, like a subsistence farming village, in, you know, this province where people farmed rice to eat it and had chickens and they ate it, right? Like, there was no production or productivity there. It was just survival in a very basic way. And you could start to see, though, the creeping in, like, the benefits, right? Like, there was a mobile health clinic that would come up the mountainside into this village and provide healthcare for people for free, and like access and like vaccines and stuff. And I could see that. And I wasn't on some like propaganda trip. It was just like some random, it was just like a cultural integration trip. It was just like, see China for yourself kind of thing. And today, right, like, those people don't even live there anymore on this like cliffside, because you can't, right? Like, it's not a sustainable way of living. It wasn't like, people weren't, it was inaccessible. People couldn't work. They were unhealthy. They couldn't get educated. It was just, it's like, people don't understand that China in like 2 decades has transitioned several hundred million people from the rural countryside, like literally people who are like peeing in, like going, they don't even have necessarily outhouses a lot of times, right? Like, or just out in the fields. Like it's incomprehensible to an American or Canadian's like concept of like just the absolute poverty that this was. And now they have like live in apartments and have electricity and housing and jobs and full education and opportunities, right? Like a pretty good living standard. And that happens within like a few decades. It's insane. It's insane. It's true. It's honestly, in my opinion, it's one of the most consequential, like most progressive things that's ever happened in human civilization, right? Like the scale of this, we're talking about like about almost 1 billion people being lifted out of, rural peasantry into modern society. It's insane, right? Like, and it's fantastic. And there's issues with it. There's flaws. There's things that aren't perfect, but like, it absolutely, like if you're looking at like what's good for humanity, what's good for the world, this is good for the world. It is much better for people to have their living standards raised this dramatically than the alternative of just living in rural poverty and which does nothing for anybody. Like it's, you kind of have to see it to believe it. It's truly incredible thing, right? Like when I was there, I think Shanghai had like 5 subways there, subway lines, 8, and then 8 years later they have like 28. Like, could you imagine that happening in the United States?
Yeah.
Could you imagine New York City?
Just adding one more stop to like our existing infrastructure is basically impossible. It's like it's unthinkable to even do that. I think it kind of speaks to this something that people get tripped up on when we talk about this as well. Is people talk about socialism and what that means, and well, what does it mean workers owning the means of production? Does it mean this classless, stateless society? And in my understanding, and this is the thing that I've really come to try to cling on to when we have these conversations, is that it's not this one specific vision, but it's a process. It's a struggle. It can be a very long process to get to this end goal of the classless, stateless society. And this process can include contradictions. It can include, mistakes and this we have to have this willingness to allow countries that are experimenting with this process to allow that to play out, and not just say, well, you did one thing wrong, and therefore we need to just drop our support for everything that you're trying to accomplish right now forever. And just understand that it is this ongoing process, and that it can take twists and turns, and it can have all kinds of different aspects and contradictions, and we need to kind of understand that. And allow other countries, whether it's China or Venezuela or Cuba or anywhere else, to allow them to go along this path without kind of like lecturing them about what socialism is and is not. And also in terms of like what you're talking about right now, this kind of modernization and the bringing people out of this extremely poverty-stricken rural lifestyle, I think that kind of gets at what the quote that Vijay Prashad and I was going around when he was talking about this, and specifically what has been happening in Xinjiang, and talking about, and people have been trying to take Vijay's comments about modernizing a people within this national project, which I think were the words he used, and kind of trying to liken that to like British colonialism or other forms of colonialism. Like people have used like the residential schools in Canada example as well. But I think what you're saying makes a lot more sense in terms of like what his argument was. And when I talked a few weeks ago to Danny Haifong, who's with Friends of Socialist China and has had these conversations, I mean, when he was in Xinjiang and talked to me about it, that's kind of what he was talking about. I think for most people over the last 20, 30 years, like their living standards have been raised like drastically. And most people are like incredibly supportive of this project. And then it's a little bit sinister that I think some people have tried to frame this as being somewhat inherently sort of colonialist in nature or restrictive, when in fact, like the living standards for everyone in this region, including Uyghurs and every single all the different ethnic groups that live there, have just been raised really drastically, which I think was what the idea of what Vijay was trying to get at with this quote. And both his quotations in this piece were I think given very were not very charitably, and that his correction was also taken kind of out of context and not being very charitable as well. Would you agree with that though? Like, do you think that's the crux of kind of what his argument was about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it, quite frankly, I find it particularly offensive for people to kind of equate his comments to British colonialism, the fact that he is himself someone from India. I think that is something that is, I think people suggesting to use that kind of comparison is like an absurd one, given like his own kind of personal context, but also it kind of also flattens a certain aspect of kind of, just because in development has kind of occurred in many colonial contexts to uplifting many people out of poverty does not necessarily mean that people who are in developing their own nation are doing the same thing. Now, to be clear here, it's not to suggest that, say, everything's, totally 100% hunky-dory in terms of the development. I think there is important dimensions of that. But I think to kind of lampoon Vijay Prashad with these kind of commentary is absolutely absurd.
Yeah, it's extremely offensive to even compare. I mean, like the goal of the colonial projects in the United States and Canada, right? Like the residential schools was annihilation.
Yeah,
like that's just the truth. Like it's verbatim. Like they would say, like we're either going to kill them or destroy any semblance of like whatever culture they had, right? Like, and then you also need to just like contextualize the fundamental nature of the states when you're comparing them. Like the United States is founded on this premise. Like you can own people, and we are taking land from people, right? Like the Second Amendment exists specifically so that people could go and have the legal right to kill Native Americans as they please, right? Like it's a horrific thing. It truly is. It's not the modern Chinese state is not. That's like they recognize. If you look at their constitution, they recognize. I think it's 52 or 54 minorities, like specifically within their constitution. Where I went in China, it was a Miao populated area. It's kind of like a linguistic ethno group that kind of crosses into Vietnam. People are called they're called the Hmong. In the United States, we call them Hmong, the Hmong people, but it's kind of one broad category. And you'd go, and things weren't necessarily like perfect, but there's very explicit efforts to like maintain their culture, like emphasize it. There's like you'd go and like very specifically, like the government would encourage and fund like part of travel is like going into villages and seeing traditional ways of making dresses and farming and dances. And you go to museums for the Miao people, and you don't. Where would you ever see that in the United States? Like, I mean, that's not something like we really do. It's we put our indigenous people on reservations. And then, and it's not to say like the situation with the Chinese Uyghur population, like it was, again, like Jorge said, like hunky-dory. It was handled like perfectly, seamlessly. This is a difficult thing. It's a very difficult topic and difficult issue to deal with, because it's like the state itself, right? Like the government can have very, explicit plans, but again, the people who are implementing it and how things are implemented, right? Like there's existing tensions and bigotries old that, from times past that you have to confront and struggle past. And that's what we've seen in China. And it's not to say like this is like some easy thing, it's some perfect thing. It's like totally devoid of it's some perfect project. But it's fundamentally different. It is a fundamentally different exercise. It is not comparable. It is not comparable to if you want to compare, you can just to see like how actually fundamentally different it is. And that's really important to emphasize, I think, in this situation, right? Like, I don't think the CPC necessarily did everything right in handling the national question with the Uyghur population, but the Uyghurs also were very much on the fringes of society in Chinese society until very recently, right? Like they're not integrated into the economy, they're disproportionately poorer, they're disproportionately less educated, and so it was a very difficult issue. Like, how do we help like uplift this group, and it's not an easy thing to handle. But like, you know, I think it's hard as Americans because we don't have like that perspective, because the history of this country has nothing to like, we never asked that question. It was always like, how do we destroy these people?
Yeah.
Like completely different. We had a totally different framing here.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is such a tricky subject to talk about, and I think it's the conversation has been kind of intentionally manipulated in this way to make it as tricky as possible, to make people uncomfortable talking about it, or at the very least to sit on the fence about it. The comparison that I always try to talk whenever this comes up to talk about is just the war on terror. And there was that piece a few weeks ago in the AP talking about how a lot of these so-called camps in Xinjiang had been kind of closed down, and like this kind of project seems to have kind of moved on, even though it was framed as this very sinister thing. The key part of that piece for me was that they talked about the origins of these policies of a few years ago, which were like very real and serious terrorism incidents that were occurring that was targeting predominantly Uyghur people. There was stabbings and terrorist attacks within mosques in this region. So there was this very real issue about this kind of violent extremism, which I guess they felt that they needed to respond to. And I always just held it up. And again, like you're saying, it doesn't mean that it was completely perfect or that every single human right was respected or there's nothing at all to criticize about it. But what I find really hypocritical is to have Americans who oversaw the last 20 years of the war on terror, which of course involved like multiple like actual military invasions of foreign countries, millions of civilians killed in these invasions, tens of millions displaced, like really like a world historic human rights atrocity over the last 20 years. And the ongoing campaign of drone warfare and political destabilization and assassinations and overthrowing governments in Libya and elsewhere. It's been a completely disastrous, violent policy, all done in the name of defending the United States from like radical extremism. And I just feel like no matter, even if you don't agree that everything was perfect about China's response to this problem, this very real problem that was existing, I think when you hold these two solutions up once against each other, you have the West, which responded to violent extremism with just like this 20-year campaign of murder and violence, versus China, who has tried to use education and bring people into this system and try and integrate them into society in like a productive way. Again, it doesn't mean that everything was totally perfect, but I just always find it a little bit rich coming from Westerners to kind of wag their fingers at China for the way that they've responded to this very real problem of extremism and separatism. Separatism also that is like partially funded and backed by Western interests for this exact reason. While our own governments have been overseeing this absolutely barbaric policy of violence and destabilization and dispossession over the last 20 years. That's always been kind of my way that I've tried to take these two things and hold them up against each other.
Sometimes I felt like I was almost like going crazy when people would talk about it, because it's like basically every mosque in the United States has like, if not an FBI informant in it, it's like wiretapped, right? Like, do we just forget that the NSA is just like was spying on everybody and like going like, and there's Guantanamo Bay and people are just being arbitrarily detained like overseas and killed in some respects. I mean, it's very difficult if you just have some sort of like, oh, okay, like who is this coming from? Like, do we have any room to talk? I think is a good question to ask yourself, right? And when you're talking about the United States and the treatment of like ethnic minorities in particular, like religious minorities, like Muslims in the United States, and just like Muslims in general, it's incomparable. I'm just like, okay, I mean, how are we even having this conversation? Like, we just passed this they just passed this bill against forced labor in Xinjiang, and it's like,
maybe you should do something with the forced labor in the United States. First of all, that would be a good place to start. If you really actually care about forced labor, that would be a good place in the actual country that you live in. Would probably be the better way to start having that conversation.
I think it's particularly rich that the country that invaded not one but two countries in the Middle East that are majority Muslim destroyed these countries, decimated them, destabilized their governments. We've kind of created camps in these countries and around the world, like in Somalia, Libya, and sending people from these regions to Guantanamo Bay, a place that we're occupying on somewhere that is not our land, and we have the audacity as a country to suggest that we know that we're going to criticize any country's kind of so-called treatment of their own Muslim population. It's not, whether the accusations are true or not is irrelevant. Who is the United States to have the gall to criticize other countries' way that they have to treat Muslims?
Yeah. And I know the often response to that is like, well, two things can be bad. The people try to just and equate them, like the war on terror is bad and that is also bad. But it's like, there really is no comparison. Like when you look at this thing side by side, it's just like the millions and millions of deaths. And it's just like again, regardless, even if you think every single accusation that's been made about China's treatment of Muslim minorities is true, not one bomb has been dropped. Not one country is being destabilized or overthrown. It's really just like, and even if you look at like the stories coming out that are researched by like Adrian Zenz and the victims of communism and that can be linked to like the ASPI and these weapons contractors, they can't even really point to like people that have actually been killed in this process. It's all this kind of very arbitrary idea of the harm that's happened, whereas we have very concrete evidence of the millions of people that have been killed in our fight against this kind of extremism. So, and again, people in the West generally, when they take this viewpoint, neither Washington nor Beijing, generally the result of people kind of trying to take this kind of fence-sitting viewpoint is just supporting the Washington consensus. Like it's ultimately still kind of contributing to that Western campaign of destabilization that this represents, right?
One thing too, I think that I would like to note is that, look, in many of these countries where we see these like again, I'm from Florida. I can't tell you how much I have to hear about Venezuela and Cuba my whole life. And I come from a working class background, right? Like nothing special, but like it never really made that much sense. I was like, it kind of sucks here too. Like the things you're describing don't sound too far off from what happens in Florida anyway.
Yeah.
But like for many of these countries that are like too, it's just a fact that, and you can ask people within these countries, like their governments have to have like the reactions have to be stronger and maybe more abrasive because of the United States and the interference that we are constantly like if there is any opening, it is crazy if you just look into how much the United States it meddles in these countries and how much they try to undermine. And so unfortunately sometimes like it makes countries have to kind of overreact to maintain their own stability. Could you imagine look at what the United States did. We invaded multiple countries, bombed everyone, over one terrorist attack, right? Could you imagine if a foreign power was pumping money and propaganda and sometimes literally like arms into the United States to like literally overthrow the government? How do you think the United States government would react?
Yeah.
Well, what do you think would happen?
I think another part too, on kind of what you're adding on to what Grayson was saying, is that everything that's going on with the discourse and debating about what's occurring in Xinjiang is not happening in a vacuum. At the way kind of, there's before Xinjiang was, Hong Kong. Before Hong Kong, it was, Tibet. Before, now they're kind of moving to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And it's the way to kind of explain to American listeners, and the way I've also explained to other Americans, that are not saying DSA and just describing them. It's like, could you imagine if the Chinese Foreign Ministry had an interest in supporting separatist movements in Texas and California and Florida and New York, and then there was like a free New York movement, and there's a free Texas movement,
Yeah.
free California movement, free Florida movement, free Hawaii movement, and all of these could have their own legitimate claims to perhaps having their own kind of identity, but
there actually should be a free Hawaii movement. I would actually support that if that existed, but
right. But and to be fair, like the analogy isn't quite the same.
Yeah.
There's a difference between the United States and
yeah,
China
of course.
in this context. But the fact of the matter is that you're just viewing it from that point of view, and you're seeing all of these kind of movements occurring, separatist movements that have a tacit support or even direct vocal support from another government that has interest in your region. You will just see it for the sham that it is. Not necessarily that people don't have the separatist movement don't exist, but rather why are they being who are they being amplified by, and whose interest the amplification of those voices serve interest towards.
Yeah. Grayson, did you have anything on that, or
I mean, honestly, just imagine if the Chinese government was like passing bills saying that they support a free Texas.
Yeah.
I mean, do you like? It would be nuclear wartime.
Yeah.
Like it's insane. It's a completely different standard. Double standard doesn't even accurately like convey how we exist in our own plane of existence as like a government when it comes to other countries, right? Like it's not even comparable. China would never do something like that. They don't. They often will be, and people will get mad about it from the left. They'll be like, "Wow, they'll go, oh, we affirm the U.S. government. Like we think insurrection is bad. Like no, right? Like because they don't want it done to them, right? And that's a pretty reasonable position. But we're like, these big parts of your country should literally break off.
Yeah.
Whatever. Screw you.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that it always comes back to, I think, whenever we talk about this kind of stuff is and these accusations that come from the West about China or a lot of any other official enemy baddie country is that it's kind of a projection, right? Like when we talk about authoritarianism or forced labor or this mass surveillance state or treatment of ethnic minorities, it's always stuff that we ourselves are extremely guilty of, that we're trying to suggest we're innocent of, and it's actually these official bad countries that are engaging in this kind of thing. And I think what you're hitting at as well, when you talk about how it's not just about Xinjiang, it's not just about Hong Kong, it's not about Tibet, it's not about Taiwan, what it is about, and this circles back to what we were talking about earlier with the Dengist reforms and the amazing economic growth that has occurred in China over the last 30 years or so. Which is, that's what it's about. It's not about, we have to understand generally that our political and media leaders don't care about human rights. They don't give a shit about human rights. If they did, they wouldn't engage in this kind of brutal, barbaric war on terror. They wouldn't fund the Saudi Arabian government or the Israeli government or any of this stuff. Our leaders don't care about human rights. So when they're making these kind of claims, whether it's about Hong Kong or Taiwan or Xinjiang or Tibet or any of these things, it's being done for a specific reason. And you realize, especially over the last few years, as I think elites, like political elites in the United States and Canada, in the West, the quote unquote international community, have realized that, oh wow, when we sort of allowed China to become part of this international community and they opened themselves up to foreign trade, we thought that was us kind of like making sure that they were under our control. But it turns out now they've taken all that economic growth and they're growing into now the number one global economy. And the fact that they are going to become eventually the number one economy is basically just like a law of physics at this point. Like it's just an inevitability. And you realize when you kind of have this understanding, you realize that a lot of these accusations about human rights and these destabilization efforts that are going on right now that's the reason. It's not because our political leaders have had a change of heart about human rights or treating ethnic minorities. It's that they realize how they are being surpassed by China as the number one global economy. We have this multipolar world order that's emerging now as a result, and they're kind of flailing against that. And I think that's the kind of main thing that whenever I try to talk about this stuff and try to make people understand that none of these conversations are ever about like what they're about on the surface. It's not about human rights. It's not about protecting Taiwan or Hong Kong or any of these places. It's about the powerful political figures in our countries who have realized now that they are being surpassed and that it's no longer this world order that's going to be completely led and dominated in all aspects by the United States. Those days are just slipping away as the United States is in decline, and they're raging against that and flailing against it. And it's really as simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think it's very clear to anyone that's kind of not totally bought into the whatever Washington is peddling that clearly the only reason they care is because of what you're describing, Rob, in terms of the decline of American power and influence. If it were merely about human rights, quote unquote, then why does the United States not say something about, say, Saudi Arabia, for instance, right? If it were merely about, say, the treatment of indigenous people in a certain region, then why does the United States say something about Australia and its treatment of the Aborigines, right? It's like, what? And also, it's a history of its own country, right? If it was merely about forced labor, then let's talk about the forced labor that exists in this country, in terms of like the prison labor that exists in all these different parts of the United States, and how the United States intentionally, whether directly or not directly, allows and perpetuates a certain, now not by name, but effectively a slave class in this country through the prison labor system in this country.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I think it's important to tell people very explicitly, you aren't the US government, right? I think sometimes you see a bit of a defensiveness over like China is overtaking us, and it comes from this insecurity because like our living standards are declining. Things are obviously getting worse here, right? Like people are insecure and generally don't have like a education or a framework to operate in. And it's like, when I talk to people, it's like, hey, look, like you're not directly responsible for this. Like this is a very much like disconnected thing. This is a machine that is kind of leeches off of everyone, the global South, and then also American workers, right? Like, much more exploitative and worse for the global South. But workers in the United States are out. You're losing out too, right? Like all the saber rattling and all the money that gets dumped into this confrontational stuff. There's not going to be like, nobody actually thinks there's going to be a real war with China. I think the Vijay Prashad framework of like a hybrid war is much more accurate, and that's what the United States is going to pursue. But that still comes at a significant cost to the globe, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
well, in the same way that the Cold War was not actually cold at all for millions and millions of people in the global South, it was in fact, a very hot war for people in, Indonesia and Vietnam and Korea and all these other places,
Yeah. If you have U.S. military bases in your country, like this isn't a fun thing, right? Like it's coming at a cost to you, significant cost. To your community and society. And then also as like the United States, it's like you get nothing. What do you get? What do I get from this? Right? Like, just be selfish for a second. What do you as a US worker get out of this like transaction? These defense companies get just blank checks to build machines of war for literally nothing, right? Like for a war that will never happen. At the expense of people abroad, and you get nothing, right? Like now you get COVID, where it's like you just die. It's a pretty bad trade. It's a pretty bad trade. So as a worker, right? Like you're talking to people as much as like if you have a fully formed or much more well-formed political understanding of the world, it's much easier. Like, and we should be focused on. First and foremost, the effects of the U.S. imperial machine on the rest of the globe. But when you're introducing this to people, you really need to be like, hey, what are you getting out of this? What are you getting out of this? So think about your day-to-day life. Like your life is getting worse, and they're telling you China is what you need to be worried about, or like you're like, I live in Florida. 10% of people here have felonies, which means they can't vote.
Yeah.
Statistically, somebody who is a second-class citizen in Florida. It is a serious thing to have a felony here. It's very easy to have a felony. You can't vote. You can't get a job. You can't get a normal job. You can't get housing. That's 10% of the population. And then about 10% of the population are people who are immigrants. who are also not able to vote and are also hyper exploited. So you have about 20% of the adult population of my state are just legally classified as second class hyper exploited people. 1/5 of the population, like adult population here, are literally legally labeled by the government as like, you can treat them even worse. Like that's like, I'm sorry, but like, it's not convincing to people when you kind of lay it out for them. When you go like, this is how we're living right now. Like you live in a pretty bad spot. Things are not good here. You really think China, you want to see this go towards China? And I think people catch on real quick. And again, COVID has made it more apparent than ever, right? They have to come out with even more outrageous claims about China now to try and dissuade people from the draconian measures of saving everyone's life in China.
At what cost?
At what cost? You might only get fresh vegetables for 2 days, free delivery to you, right?
No, and to be clear, what kind of is missed by the fresh vegetables and not that discourse is actually people don't know is that originally when people were being received food was mostly like kind of meat and dairy, and people complained on the social media of China that we're not getting enough food in terms that are not just meat and dairy. And so in response, the government sent vegetables. That's where that came from.
Yeah.
One thing too, I think thank you. That's a good point. The Chinese government, which again, we're told as Americans, they are these draconian, authoritarian, malicious, look, people protest in China all the time. There are strikes in China. People get mad. They complain. You're allowed to complain. You don't get sent to prison for complaining. The government is incredible. Way more like Jorge's just points. Could you imagine the United States your local municipal government listening to you? Oh, sorry for only giving you meat and dairy. We'll give you some fresh veggies now. Come on, right? We had some of the largest, if not largest, mass protests in U.S. history 2 summers ago, in summer 2020. What did you get? Nothing. You got some rich people kneeling, right?
And the police got more money. They got something, I guess, out of that. Yeah.
The police got to brutalize you in on
New York
camera.
City elected a mayor that was a police officer.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Chicago.
People talk about China so-called being a police state, buddy. New York City is a police state. Literally, we elected a police officer as mayor of New York City, and deputy mayor was also a former police officer.
It's you don't live in a democracy in the United States, right? And that's why the Chinese Communist Party are starting. They're kind of like, hey, we actually do democracy, and I'm not going to claim it's some perfect system where things are whatever. They're developing it. They're working it out. It's not whatever. But to talk about the United States or try and convey, you look at those Freedom House rankings, flawed democracy. It's it's illegal for me to protest in Florida now.
From the Henry Kissinger Institute of Democratic Observation or whatever.
If a group of people, I think it's if you have a group 9+ or more, and even briefly go into the street in Florida, you can be RICO acted now.
Yeah,
awesome. That's cool. That's some freedom there.
Well, this is the thing. I think if you ask people in China, it's not about whether it's democracy or not democracy, but what it is not is Western liberal democracy, which I think most people there, I don't want to speak for Chinese people, are actually quite happy to not have a Western liberal democracy when they see the state of what's going on in Canada, the United States, and the complete dysfunction of the inability of the government to even do fucking anything for its citizens. I think they're more than happy to not have a Western liberal democracy. And I think something I wanted to touch on as well. I don't want to keep you guys too much longer because you've been very gracious with your time at really short notice. But when you talk about as well the global South and the pernicious influence of U.S. imperialism throughout the global South, and that's frankly this is the thing I end up talking about often whenever this comes up on this program, exactly why my stance when it comes to this question, what does the left do about China, and why I think that what the left should be doing is critically supporting this country and supporting this project and pushing back against the relentless propaganda campaign about it. It's not even necessarily about, what's happening in China. It's not about what's happening in America, but it's because of the alternate vision for development in the global south that is now available to countries in Latin America and in Africa and other places, who for now decades and decades have had one option. If they want development, if they want to build roads and ports and bridges, you have the American version, the IMF, the World Bank, and taking these very predatory loans from the West, which often comes with all kinds of preconditions. You have the West completely destabilizing their countries if they ever do anything that they don't like. And all of a sudden there's an alternative to that just didn't exist for our whole lifetimes. And that's something that's really inspiring and cool, and something that we should all support, I think, if you count yourself on the left, is the idea that China's rise as this global hegemon, whether you agree with them using capitalism as this mode of production or not, the reality is there is now an alternative for these global south countries to develop, and they can do it outside of the US system. That's something that we should all support, because capitalist development, Western style capitalist development in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America and all these other places has been a fucking disaster for everybody. So the idea that there's now a different alternative to that, that's, I think, something that's really inspiring and good, and something that we should just support. If you're on the left and you're wondering what we should do, we should say, yes, this is a good thing, and we should do what we can to push back against this relentless propaganda campaign and not contribute to it.
Well, Rob, what China's doing, they're doing imperialism, colonialism now. That's actually what's happening.
Yeah.
No, and I think actually you bring up a fantastic point, and actually I think it's a good thing to compare the different relationships. Like, frankly, how China does it just does business deals. Like, they're business deals, both sides benefit. There's a cost, but everybody makes a little bit of money. There's some benefit, whatever. Like, they're legitimate deals. Right. Like, China doesn't go into a country. There's no threat of violence. They're not going, hey, wink, wink, we might overthrow you. Like, look at that aircraft carrier off the coast. Like, that's not happening. Yeah. Right. They're business deals. You take it or leave it, but they're pretty fair. I have a buddy. He's Greek, and he always tells me, he's like, yeah. Back when the Greek financial crisis, they were happening, like, China was like, look, we'll buy and develop this port. We will recognize all the Greek unions, whatever. We don't care. And what actually happened was the Germans in the EU intervened. Were like, whoa, no, you can't do that.
Yeah,
and made the Greek government take like a worse deal with the Chinese. But like the way that Western it's literally like, we need these countries to remain undeveloped, right? Like African, Latin American, because all we do is extract from them, take. Right, like you need the raw materials to be as cheap as possible. So if these countries are developed and like have their productive forces developed, right, like suddenly it's going to cost us too much for us to make our Funko Pops, right? Like that's the nature of the relationships, and it has to be enforced through very explicit violence, right? But the way that the Chinese development model works and its relationships internationally is that it's beneficial for China, for its partners, to have to develop as countries, right? Like to have infrastructure and advance and like grow and develop. It's better for them, right? Like the type of relationship is completely different. And it's like when people are like, oh, it's not really an alternative, it's like a poison pill. No, it's not. It's just like a business deal. I'm not going to claim it's some like benign, like, true from the heart, like godly, like socialist thing, but but no, it's a more like realistic kind of like, all right, like we're gonna do some deals, like we'll be partners, trading partners, and we'll get this and you get that. So here, we're gonna help you build trains and shit. Like, oh wow, what a terrible deal. Meanwhile, the United States is like, look, you're gonna keep letting our, the Belgians like pump out uranium ore, or we're gonna kill you all. Like that's literally how it works. So yeah, I think it's important to highlight that difference too, because people they go, oh, no, it's also imperialism, it's also colonialism.
Yeah, I think another aspect too, and you mentioned before about like there being an alternative, the kind of China offering that. I think an aspect as well was like you mentioned people in China are glad they don't have a liberal democracy. I think even that point is, you don't even necessarily have to view the model that China has as something favorable. All you have to know is three things. One, first of all, it's none of our business. People of China have the right to decide whatever society they want to have because that's their society. Who are we to suggest, what they should do for other people? That's like the definition of what colonialism is. Second, people of China like what they have, and this has kind of been petered out by data in terms of polling. There's a study that was done by Harvard University in collaboration with many local organizations in China that was done in it was a study done over the course of years, but concluded in 2019 and was published in 2020, shortly after COVID started. But the study, for the most part, had been done before COVID, and they asked over 10,000 people all over China what their opinion was of the government in China, and they also asked people in the United States about basically what is a comparison, and in China overall, people's approval rating above the national government, basically the CPC, was 95% in favor. And that should tell you everything you need to know. Because could you imagine if there was any kind of president in this country that had a 95% approval rating? That's just unimaginable, right? Yeah. But some people would suggest, well, they're just indoctrinated. Well, first of all, how can you indoctrinate over 1 billion people? I think that's just like a totally absurd claim, but also it's in my opinion, fundamentally racist to suggest that, oh yeah, all these people don't know how to think. They just don't have their own independent thoughts, really. So I think that's an aspect. And the third point is, quite frankly, it's like, you don't have to necessarily, it's none of our business. The people of China already view it favorably, but also, quite frankly, if people are worried about what's going on in China, you can have those opinions, but the fact of the matter is if you are someone who lives in the West, particularly if you're leftist and lives in America, your focus should primarily be worried about what the U.S. is doing in the world. Could you imagine if they, consider say Star Wars? There's some citizen that lived in say the Empire, and then criticizing, well, the rebels do X or Y thing. It's like, okay, well, sure, maybe perhaps this action or this other action may not have been the best thing, but let's just focus on the fact that you live in the Empire, right? It's like this awful, horrible regime that imposes its will upon the rest of the galaxy, or in our case, the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing too, when you talk about, they're just brainwashed, I think that's the ultimate form of chauvinistic Western projection. This idea, people have convinced themselves of this idea that, we don't have propaganda. Can you imagine living in one of these scary countries that has this propaganda, and you're constantly inundated with it? And people are so oblivious to the incredible extreme extent to which we are indeed inundated with propaganda from cradle to grave in the West, to convince us that this is the only legitimate way of having a democracy, is the only legitimate way of doing things, that America and Canada and the international community are the good guys against the evil enemy states. People really, I think, have bought into this. It's the ultimate propaganda coup, is convincing people that they're not propagandized to, and they are not themselves brainwashed. And then you have people just kind of uncritically repeating a lot of points that they hear in official state media in the United States, without realizing the extent that it is state media, and buy into this idea that we have a free press and these other countries don't. That to me is the ultimate form of the ultimate propaganda coup. The fact that you have so many people in this country that will point to places like China and talk about the authoritarian, evil propaganda campaigns that are engaged there, while being just completely obliviated to the fact that we've all grown up in the most sophisticated propaganda machine, basically in all of human history. It's actually kind of impressive when the level of not to use the Orwellian term doublethink, but it really is true. This idea that we're immune to this stuff, and all these other countries are just these gullible foreigners that just get brainwashed by this evil government propaganda campaign. It's the ultimate form of Western projection.
You can literally, it's not hard to talk to just your average Chinese person. It's really not, right? You can just ask, that's the thing, is whenever I read, I don't know, it's like, even you see like people who are like, the United States is really bad, like maybe China, it's like, I don't really necessarily fully believe the Chinese like numbers or anything. It's like, why? Talk to someone. Like you can literally just hit people up. It's not that hard. They're not going to get in trouble. They will talk to you. People talk. Like, it's not hard to talk to Chinese people. It really isn't. They have the internet too. Like, we go, oh, they can't be on Facebook. It's like, there's other websites, and they have VPNs too. It's not like it's not that big of a deal. It's pretty easy and accessible.
Americans worry about, say, people regulating the internet, and yet only go on 5 websites. Makes you wonder how that they don't see the irony in that statement.
Yeah, it's like, well, yeah, and you complain about the Great Firewall or whatever, and it's like, have you been on Reddit recently? Like, we absolutely banned that. We should be talking about this, definitely. I guess we should cut it off there, Grayson and Jorge. But I just wanted to say once again that I really appreciated both of you to take the time to come and have this discussion with me. Again, really, really short notice. I appreciate it a lot. So thank you. The community appreciated it a lot as well. Thank you to you both for the discussion.
Thanks, Rob. And real quick, can I just plug some DSA?
Yeah, plug away. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So, hey, everyone in the chat watching, appreciate it. If you're not a member of DSA, hey, it'd be cool if you joined. It's not that hard to join. If you are a member of DSA, please, I'm going to drop some links. My name's Godly. I have like a really cringy Twitch. I don't really use Twitch, but like you can join the DSA International Committee. You can apply for it. I really highly recommend it if you're a member of DSA. And if not, you're not a member, you should join. We also have a open letter to U.S. congressional representatives that you can fill out to oppose the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which is a really bad, like, anti-Chinese bill, like huge. So I'm going to post a link to that right now. I am posting the link to the DSA International Committee. Onlin actually just posted it. Thank you, Onlin. And then also another one to send, like, an open letter. And then also, you want to donate to the International Committee. We send delegations across the world to observe elections, meet with socialist governments and parties across the world. So I'm also going to drop a donation link. If you're interested, you got like a few bucks, help us support our work that we do. So thank you all. Yeah, I just dropped the links. Thank you again. Thank you, Rob, so much for having us on.
All right, did you have anything you wanted to plug as well?
Just join DSA International Committee. And if you want to hear more about what I'm saying, go to my Twitter at line goes down. I thought it was put in the chat. And be sure to check out my and Jamie Peck's podcast, Everybody Loves Communism.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, my Twitter is stupid too. Name9 yet. No, I'll put that in the chat.
I dropped it in there as well. But I hope everyone.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I hope everyone gives you guys a follow. Thanks again to both of you. I really appreciate you taking the time.